As instructional designers, we are challenged to create learning experiences that, one, motivate and engage learners, two, to provide practice opportunities to gain confidence in using new skills and knowledge, three, assess learning progress, and four, give meaningful feedback to improve performance. Gamification elements can help with each of these design challenges. So there's a lot to learn today, and let's take a look at these design challenges. The first one, learner engagement. We know people love playing games. We see that people can play games for hours and hours. So what are the game elements for attention and engagement? And how can we use this for training? The second design challenge is about providing practice opportunities. Knowing what to do in a situation, that's one thing. But really using what you have learned in the heat of the moment, that's something else. That takes confidence. In games, you have different levels. And with each level, you need more skills and confidence to reach the goal. How can we take this into account while creating VR scenarios? The third challenge is about assessment. In games, assessment is embedded in a gameplay as performance-based activity. It is continuous and measured by player actions. How can we benefit from this in training? And the last challenge is about feedback. Feedback in games is given real time. Natural consequences reveal the missteps in applying incorrect logic or in taking or following an incorrect logic path. Providing both immediate and delayed feedback is one of the hallmarks of great video games. So why is this important and how can we utilize this for training? Let's learn that today. Hi, my name is Danny de Bruin, one of the co-founders of Warp VR. And back in the days while studying human resource management, I met my guest of today while doing research for my thesis about gamification and recruitment. Because he has been listed as a top 10 worldwide gamification guru and talked about this subject at many international events. He is a long-term entrepreneur who used game thinking and gamification for many companies and organizations. And he happens to be my companion at Warp VR, and his name is Thijs de Vries. Hey, Thijs.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks so much.
Great. Today, we're going to talk about what gamification is, how you can use it for training, and how we can use what we have learned today in your immersive scenarios. But maybe first, before we start, I think I know you pretty well, but I was wondering myself today, how do you become a top 10 worldwide gamification guru?
Wow, that is a great question. Maybe a question that you should ask actually to the people who kind of nominated me in order to be in that spot. But I think back in the day, before Warp VR, I worked a lot for organizations on applying gamification, game thinking, to help them with that. But I also shared a lot of my experience. So I used, social networks, Twitter, LinkedIn, obviously, in order to share a lot about gamification, how you can apply it, the latest research. So my followers, let's say, grew interested in that subject. And I think that gave me that position.
Cool. And now you use it as well at Warp VR.
Absolutely, every day.
Very cool. Hey, what is gamification for you?
That's a great question, and also directly a difficult one, I think, because the definitions of gamification do vary, quite a bit. For me, it's all about playful learning, and those two words actually are very connected. I think, when we play as human beings, when we play as kids, we actually learn. But also when we learn and we enjoy learning, because we learn something new, it gives us a good feeling, a similar feeling as when we play. So, those two words are very connected. This reminds me actually of a research I've read a long time ago, though, which also really was about playful learning. And in this research, they looked at tigers, actually, young tigers that are being very physical when they play with each other. So, when they're just a couple of years old, they play a lot, obviously, but they get very physical and they get scars from playing. So you could actually wonder, is that playful? But it's definitely playful, and it's also learning, because whenever they do that, they make sure they get skills that they need in order to survive when they get older. Through playful learning and through that, playful approach with each other, they tend to learn all kinds of skills, they need whenever they're being attacked, later on when they're in their more mature life, let's say. So also there you see that playful learning is, can be playful, almost without a goal, just to play, but there's always a goal there eventually. And I think that this two-sided approach of playful learning can be found in games as well. So looking at games, let's take World of Warcraft as an example. Very big game. It's what we call a MMORPG, massive multiplayer online role-playing game. Biggest abbreviation that I know. But there's two goals in there as well. Obviously this game is built for entertainment purposes. You play it, kind of to have fun. It's massive multiplayer, so you play with a lot of people together. But there are other goals as well. And throughout playing this game, you get to learn people skills, and you get to learn management skills. So there's been stories actually from, IBM is one of these companies that said, hey, whenever you play these type of games, and also whenever you're a guild leader, guild is a group of people, group of players who need to go into combat. List this on your resume. Put it on your resume, because whenever you've been a guild leader of a massive guild, we know you've got some qualities which you could use, in the work side as well. So put that on your resume next to whatever other things you've learned, because it's important. You can learn from games, and I think that's really for me where gamification comes in, being able to apply game thinking, game techniques in a different context than games. So how can we apply this two-sided learning approach, having fun but learning something at the same time as well? How can we apply that, for instance, in education or in corporate learning? So that's really where it sits for me.
Great. While looking at the Lions and having a double goal, so to say, it's for fun, but it's also needed to learn skills that you need throughout life. How do you see this double goal concept in your current role at Warp?
This double goal, which we often call a game goal and a learning goal. So the game goal is kind of having fun, or there's a specific goal in the game, while the learning goal is the fact that you learn a certain skill set. Is actually what happens in story-based immersive learning as well. So, looking indeed at our work for clients, when we create these VR training scenarios and we assist clients in order to do so, we discuss this double goal as well. So very often in these VR trainings, there is a specific goal within the VR training. So learners are actually being briefed about that, in that first initial scene, or maybe even before, meaning that they know what the goal of that specific scenario is. They don't know how to get there though, but they do know kind of the end goal. So, they need to make sure they make the right decisions in order to get there. But on the other hand, that game goal is just a made up, often, game goal in a VR scenario. But there's a learning goal that sits underneath, which isn't that obvious always for learners. But they do realize after reaching that game goal that they actually learn something. So it could be, safety awareness, that could be a learning goal. So the fact that you are in a work site, you're doing a VR training on safety, and the learning goal is really to be aware of unsafe situations. While the game goal is something completely different, because you've got a job to do and you need to do it, and maybe need to do it as fast as possible. I mean, that could be the game goal. So you get You get this briefing at the start saying, hey, do this job as soon as possible. And you go start and do it. But at the end, you only realize, hey, there's actually more to learn than how to do that procedure. Because it's also about unsafe situations, right? And you need to be aware of that. And I think that's really applicable when it comes to these high quality, story-based immersive learnings.
And do you think that the game goal is then meant to make it fun rather than the learning goal to gain skills? And maybe in general, is gamification meant to make things fun?
I actually got that question a lot also in the time when I was, trying to create a lot of these gamification experiences. And absolutely, games are being perceived as fun. I mean, if you would ask somebody, do you think games are fun? Then probably you get a yes. But it's actually not completely true. So it's partly true. And it's partly true because games definitely have fun elements. I mean, whenever, let's say for video games, whenever you succeed in playing a level, that's great. I mean, and the game itself awards you in order, for the fact that you succeeded at that level. You get 3 stars, you're the best, you're awesome, keep on playing, and then you keep on playing. So there's definitely an element of fun. But the fun is only there whenever it's been complicated in order to get there. I mean, you can imagine if you have a game which is so super easy to play, that's not fun. That's simply boring. So you need complexity and you need frustration in order to kind of experience that fun, right? So there's only fun whenever there's frustration. And actually there's also here research been done about games and about kind of the how much frustration there is in a game versus how much fun there is. And it seems to be somewhere around 80-20. So 80% frustration while 20% of fun. Well, still, if you would ask people, which game did you play? Was it fun? People will probably tell, it was a little bit frustrating, but it was mostly fun, which is not the case. And this is fun. So maybe taking an example, which is completely different, let's say, from video games or VR learning. I saw somebody spoke about this, and I think it's a very applicable example, which is about playing golf. Playing golf in itself is super easy, right? There's a rule, or there's a goal, the game goal, which is you have to pick up a ball, and it needs to go into a hole. Super easy, you just pick up the ball, you walk to the hole, and you drop it in. Super boring as well, right? So when you would add rules and obstacles, exactly what happens in games, only then it gets interesting, right? So golf has all these obstacles. There's a bunker. There's different types of grass. There's a green. The hole is miles away. You need to hit the ball with a club. You cannot pick it up, and you need a variety of clubs actually in order to get it into that hole. So many rules and obstacles, and this is where it gets fun. And it gets fun because it's difficult in order to do so. Frustration is therefore required in order to have fun. So same is exactly true for games. Same is true for learning experiences. It needs to be difficult, but never too difficult. It definitely doesn't, it definitely should not be boring, So it requires the right amount of difficulty in order to really make sure that people can play for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah, and this research, I think I remember it during the research I did for the thesis. They filmed faces, right, to recognize.
Absolutely,
the
emotions, they did. Yes, they did. Yeah, so they put a camera indeed on gamers, and you see all these weird emotions. So face really happy, but super happy, but also super angry and frustrated, and yeah, these emotions are definitely part of playing games.
Yeah, cool. I can remember it. Hey, and so the rules make the game complex. Is that true?
Absolutely.
And when we look at VR trainings, how is this applicable to VR training? So how can we make rules or make a VR scenario more complex?
Yeah, that's indeed what this is about. And it might be the most difficult thing actually in this. So it requires, eventually this requires a lot of play testing, right? So in order to kind of improve the challenge. So whenever you set up a VR training, also whenever you create a game, you start with that double goal. So you start with that game goal. You know what kind of the learning goal is going to be. And that game goal, a player needs to go from, the starting point all the way to that game goal, right? And that's the challenge they have to go through. And then it's a matter of fact of creating these rules in order to make it interestingly difficult. And in VR training, it's the same. So you want to have that player go through situations which are not easy. And you could do that, for instance, by asking the right questions. You wrote a tremendous blog post actually about that, so it's on our website. But that's one of the key elements in order to kind of find that right challenge. Ask those questions which put up an interesting dilemma, which are not easy to answer, which maybe you're even being steered, towards a wrong answer, in order to kind of make it more interesting and more difficult. And that's kind of what learners really need. They need that challenge. They need to have the feeling they have overcome something in order to remember it.
Yeah. During the last webinar I did, it was about storytelling, and there we talk about obstacles, right? So you have your starting point and you have your goal, the end point. Okay, what kind of obstacles do you as a player encounter along the way? And maybe you have two big obstacles, main obstacles, and maybe some smaller ones along the way to get things difficult. And indeed, dilemmas can be one of those things to make it more difficult to answer.
Absolutely,
yeah. What we also see in games is that people can play it for hours and hours. How do they do this?
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm myself completely amazed, sometimes, because I've seen statistics and World of Warcraft as an example again, but it's a couple years back, so they're probably new statistics. But there are players doing this as a full-time job. They work, they get home, then they play for 8 hours. I mean, how? So there's absolutely mechanisms in there which make people play for as long as possible almost. And there are a couple of ways of doing this, let's say. So let me rephrase. There are a couple of ways on how to look at this. One is from the motivation angle. So when people are motivated, it means that they are willing to do something. So they have a motivation towards playing that game. And that motivation really comes from within themselves. So there's not somebody on the outside saying, hey, you get €1,000 if you play this game. I mean, that could be motivating, but it's an extrinsic motivation. And that motivation often only lasts, a couple of times. Intrinsic motivation is something completely different that can last forever. Again, here, research, like to tap from research, there's been research done about intrinsic motivation and kind of the key elements which consist of intrinsic motivation. And there are actually 3 key elements. One is autonomy. Autonomy meaning you are in control and you can make sure that there's a difference in outcome based on your decisions. And this is what games are, obviously. I mean, you do something, you go left, and something different happens than when you go right. So you control the outcome of whatever happens in that game. So there's autonomy. So the fact that you can control it yourself, the fact that you are at the steering wheel, and you can decide. That's super important. It's within the game, but it's also about the game. So if I would tell you, hey, you have to play this game, it's probably not as interesting as the fact that you want to play this game, right? So there's a difference there. So this is all about autonomy. Second element is mastery. And that's the ability to grow, the ability to learn and to apply and adopt new skills. And again, here, throughout life, we learn lots of things. I mean, we talked about the young tigers, for instance. They learn a lot of things. But the problem with that is that we don't always realize that we've learned something, right? So throughout life, there's no checkbook somewhere saying, hey, you've learned this and this and that, and when you were 8, you learned this, when you were 12, you learned this. You also forget how skilled you were back in the days. You just don't remember. So you know how skilled you are right now, but you forget how skilled you were a couple of years back. And this is what games do very well, because they introduce levels, right? So if there's a game and it's 100 levels and you're at level 80, you know you're doing pretty well because you already passed that first 80 levels. So the fact that these games help you to give insight in mastery and how much skills you've already learned is super helpful. So we get that, we get a good feeling from that. Each time we learn something, each time we progress, we get a good feeling, and we want to keep on playing. Last element, super important, is purpose. And purpose is really about the fact that you feel a sense of purpose in order to play these games. So obviously same counts for VR trainings, but you need to feel a sense of purpose in order to play this game. And games do this very often by narrative. So, there's this game, there's this princess, you need to save her, that's the end goal of the game. But you do really feel that sense of purpose because there's so much going on in that game, there's so much narrative, there's so much storytelling that you're completely immersed in that, right? And therefore you do feel that purpose of really going there. So that could be part of purpose. Another aspect of purpose could be the fact that, in these MMORPGs that we talked about, is that a lot of people play these games. So the fact that you're part of something really big could give you purpose. So there are a couple of ways of looking at purpose. Whenever looking at training, e-learnings, VR trainings, classrooms, whatsoever, this sense of purpose needs to be there in order to remember what you learned. If you do not know why you're learning something, there's a big chance you're going to forget, right? So this is definitely the problem when you are looking at compliance training, for instance. People do not know why they're learning something, When they do not know why they're learning, they'll probably forget. If they know why it is important what they learn, because it contributes to the business or it contributes to themselves as human beings, then they're intrinsically motivated. Then they're going to remember what they learn.
Yeah, great. It's super interesting. I often says also, I sometimes say, you learn a lot what you have to do. So you have to do this, and you may not do that. But the reason behind it, I think you only learn that, and also looking at the game, through the consequences, right? To experience those consequences. Okay, if I do this, then this is the result. Do I want that? Yes or no? And if you don't want it, you have new experience, new knowledge, new skills that you can apply in making another decision, right?
Absolutely. So you're here repetition, and this is obviously the reason why people can play hours and hours. Repetition is a really important aspect in this. So in order indeed to progress and to really achieve that mastery, you probably need to try it over and over again. Maybe Angry Birds as an example. I mean, if I would tell you there's this mobile game, you have to shoot pigs with birds. Do you think it's going to be fun? You'll probably be like, oh, that's not fun. I mean, why am I going to play that? Still, it's the most successful mobile game ever. Millions and millions and millions of players. Why? Because they made it difficult, but not too difficult. So there's a lot of repetition here as well. You're probably gonna if you play a level there, you're probably gonna fail 9 times. You're only gonna succeed the 10th time you're gonna try, because you can reach that goal. You can reach a level. It's difficult, but you can reach it. So getting to that mastery by trying over and over again is absolutely important.
So with Angry Birds, they are successful because it is just enough challenge. It's just easy enough to keep it interesting, right? To keep you motivated to play.
Absolutely.
So looking at this challenge, what is the right challenge? How do you create the right challenge?
Yeah, well, this is obviously difficult. I mean, I already said that creating this right challenge also requires a lot of play testing. You need to test whether the challenge is the perfect fit, let's say, for the player.
And for the target audience, right? Well, creating
exactly. Exactly. So one of actually the techniques in order to create these right challenges is by using engagement loops. So you already talked about the consequence, whatever you experience indeed through storytelling and a story-based scenario. You talked about this with Dio in the previous webinar. The fact that you experience a consequence is actually feedback on whatever choice you made just before, right? So in a evacuation training, you could go left, you could go right, but probably one of these answers is the right answer. but you're going to experience, you're going to get feedback from the VR training, whatever answer was best. And it's no problem if you made, the wrong choice, because, you're in a safe environment to learn and you can try over and over again. But this whole feedback and, experience that consequence is actually part of an engagement loop. That's how we call that. And an engagement loop actually is 4 steps. And these engagement loops happen multiple times within games, within levels even. So engagement loops actually start with an action. You need to do something. You need to answer a question. You need to decide, go left, go right. You need to battle with a soldier in order to save a princess in a game. I mean, it could be anything. It's an action. It's something you need to do. You start doing it, then you get feedback from doing it. So whenever that evacuation is there, maybe you go left and you realize that the emergency exit is actually very far away. So you get feedback from that. That feedback gives you an emotion, In that evacuation training, you could be like, I need to get to the exit as soon as possible. So you get a bit of anxiety, You realize you took the wrong turn, and you now know that the exit is even farther away, right? So it does something with you. It gives you a certain emotion. And from that emotion comes that new action. It's actually a trigger towards a new action. So you have to decide what you're going to do next based on that feedback and based on that emotion. So either way, turn around, go the other way, maybe decide to find another exit, could be anything. But that in itself is an engagement loop. So that new action you're going to do after that feedback, after that trigger, is actually that start of a new feedback loop or an engagement loop. So these follow up pretty fast within games, giving you constant feedback, but also giving you the ability to constantly adapt your strategy in order to still being able to succeed in playing that level. Maybe you fail eventually, which is completely fine. You can try again, but then you learn new skills. You've got new information to try again and try to succeed that second time.
Yeah, because the third step is emotion. Where is the skills or information you get during the second step? Where do you see this in this model? It's because it's your new choice. It's not only based on emotion, right? It's also about gaining new knowledge, maybe even gaining a new skill that you can use to change your strategy throughout the game.
Well, absolutely. So you get new information, therefore, you need to make a new decision. But often, we as human beings make decisions based on emotion. And that's why this is important. So either way, we fight, we flight, or we freeze. And these things often happen when, it gets stressful, when the emotions run high. So that's a beauty, actually, of games, and definitely the beauty of VR training, is the fact that we can get close to that emotion. We can make sure that you are super stressful, that you feel, you get sweaty hands, your heart races, because you realized you saw a consequence which is not helpful for going to that game goal. You went left in that evacuation training. You need to get out of the building as soon as possible, and you realize you took a wrong turn. So that does something to you.
Yeah.
And the fact that you experience that emotion and you try again, and therefore maybe experience that emotion a little bit differently, make sure that you're being able to apply that in real life more successfully because you've been there before. You've experienced that emotion and you know what to do. Also here, research again, there's been research saying that it's easier to remember things whenever it's connected to an emotion. And actually the brain does this. This is actually research being related to trauma even. So when you encounter a very stressful situation and which can be traumatic, we experience and we save that emotion with the right steps to do, because the brain actually helps us whenever we encounter such an event again, which is super stressful. We already stored what to do, so we don't have to go through that emotion again. So it's helping us. It's kind of guarding us almost. For those type of events, and on a smaller scale, obviously this is definitely what happens in impactful, emotional-based, story-based learnings.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the immersion to feel emotions, right? You have, of course, gamification elements, also storytelling, which can really immerse you into the training, but also the medium, right? So you can play on a mobile phone, you can play on a tablet, on a VR headset, but also there we feel maybe even more that it can make a difference to play in a VR headset, right? To be really fully immersed in what you see. You see it on when we are in a congress, right? And you put someone on a headset. It can be very busy and loud where you are, but the moment they put on the headset, they are gone. You can scream their names, but they don't hear you anymore, right?
Absolutely. So here again, like if you would do an e-learning on a laptop and somebody would ask you, hey, do you want a cup of coffee? You can respond. Impossible with a VR training. So you put on the VR headset, you're there, you're immersed. It's impossible to think about anything else because it's emotional and it's impactful and you're there and you're going through it. So absolutely.
Yeah. We have the demo about the angry customer in the store, right? And also there it's about, okay, how do you help this lady? And the consequence is either she walks out angry or she's happy and maybe even buy something else at your store because you helped her in such a way. So there the consequences of this feedback loop is also shown really well, I think, right?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure.
So let's take a few steps back. At the beginning you said gamification also makes it fun. Of course you have the frustration, but it's also to make to engage people through fun. We know VR training is also used for assessment. You talked about it last time during the last webinar with one of our partners and their client. And we also know that most people, also myself, I remember, while doing an assessment, it doesn't feel like fun because you don't have the feeling you can make any mistakes. How do you see that with gamification?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think this also kind of ties into how we see education and how we see to test people, right? I mean, an assessment or any test for that matter is to check whether you've known, the theory, the right answers. So also when you look at the school system and educational system in general, what we tend to do is to give a lot of theory. We explain, we tell, it's really sending information. And then finally we're going to test. All right, so a lot of information, then we test whether you know that information. If you look at games and from a learning perspective, it's different. We actually, that test, which is at the end in a trimester, for instance, in the educational system, we put completely at the beginning. So what we do in that first initial level, we directly test people. And probably they're not going to know. Probably they're not going to succeed. Probably they're going to fail, which is perfect because they can experience that consequence. And they can try again, because remember, it's a safe environment to learn. So throughout testing, you can learn these skills. And it's a truly different approach because you learn by doing, in fact. And I mean, this is eventually also the case for VR training. So I think this is also kind of, in a bigger sense, it's company culture. Are you okay with the fact that your employees are able to fail, And in a VR training, failing isn't that expensive, If there is a fire training and, the whole factory burns down, it's a little bit cheaper in VR than in real life. So it's okay to fail. I mean, we create these situations where people are allowed to fail. And that's okay. But you do need to be a company where you think that's okay as well, right? So we've got a lot of data. Data is part of Warp Studio. Also in the last webinar, we talked about this. It's real, true behavioral data. As a company, you shouldn't look at that data saying, hey, this employee failed 9 times. No, you should look at that 10th time where he did succeed, because that truly means that he understands it. It's even better maybe than that employee that succeeded directly that first time, because they didn't see the consequences. So they might not apply the procedure in a correct way. So that safe environment to learn is super, super important.
Okay, safe environment to learn is important. Why or how is VR a safe environment in your opinion?
Well, I think it's partly of the how the experience is being built up. So I think that's one factor in it. The fact that we look at games a lot in order to create the most engaging VR trainings. People have to make choices. They might give a wrong choice. They see the consequence. One of the elements that we've applied in Warp Studio is the fact that you can put scores to certain answers and therefore can get a final score at the end. And a final score means that if you didn't do the best score, you should probably try again to at least try to do better, right? Mastery aspect in this. I think the other one is also the fact that VR is an individual approach, right? You put on the VR headset and you're in a different world. You're sitting here in this chair, but with the VR headset, you could be, in a factory. You could be somewhere else. You could be on an oil rig. You could be everywhere. That's in that sense safe because it's your experience. So you can, you're being immersed and you can make your choices. There's not somebody looking over your shoulder, which could give you more difficulty in order to give that right answer. We've heard stories actually from clients that were doing soft skills training in VR, where usually they did this in an office building with actors on site. But their colleagues and their managers even were in that exact same room, and they needed to do a sales training. You can imagine that that's pretty hard when your colleagues are watching, when your manager is watching. That doesn't feel safe. But when you do that in VR, in the right context, so not just a meeting room in an office building, but an actual context with an actual salesperson, which obviously is an actor when we record it, but can play that emotion very well, you feel a lot safer in order to make decisions there. But it's on different levels. I mean, it's in the VR training. It's also the willingness of the clients that we work with, to make sure to tell their employees, it's okay to fail. It's completely fine. Do please experience those consequences. It's even better. And eventually this will have a positive business impact, when you experience those consequences.
Yeah, I think it's also with it's also the playful aspect in this kind of training, right? So even though maybe that a certain choice is wrong, maybe you just want to try.
Yeah, you just want to experience. Exactly.
To experience why is this the wrong decision, and what maybe you're also just curious. What happens if I do this or that? I know I'm not allowed to, but let me see why I'm not allowed to, and understand that, right?
Yeah. And also kind of really experience what it does to you, when it's a sales training and that person on the other side of the table gets super angry. I mean, what effect does that have on you? I mean, it's good to experience that.
Yeah, it's all, again, practice experience that you gain, right?
Learning by doing.
Yeah, making mistakes. And we see that's also, you have also a lot of research that shows that you learn a lot from making mistakes, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's tons of research. There's research where VR trainings that our clients create have been part of that research, which clearly states that there's an increase in remembering procedures when learning with VR, opposed to a different kind of learning and a different kind of learning where it's not as easy to make mistakes, because you want to do right, because the way of training is completely different.
Yeah, and again, I think it's also the safe environment because the consequence for you as a player or learner isn't that big when you make a mistake in VR, right?
Absolutely. So, also from a financial side,
yeah. So a lot of information about gamification, but what if I want to start tomorrow with using gamification in my next VR scenario? How do I start?
Well, about starting, we kind of need to kind of summarize, what we've been discussing here. So whenever you're going to write that new VR training scenario, start with that double goal. Probably the learning goal. Which procedure you want your employees to know. So that learning goal is probably not going to be a problem. But think about that game goal and think about it from a narrative perspective. Like, which story can I tell in order for people to get somewhere from the beginning of a scenario all the way to the end, as fast as possible out of a building, doing a job as good as possible, making sure you get that sales deal going. I mean, this could all be game goals based on a story. So that's really where you start. Learning goal you have, game goal you're going to develop. From that moment on, you're going to think about intrinsic motivation. We discussed autonomy, mastery, purpose. Think about those decisions that trainees can make throughout that scenario, throughout reaching that game goal, which can control the outcome. So you need different outcomes. So you've got a game goal, but start thinking about those different outcomes. What's the best possible outcome, when the procedure's been done right, but also what's the worst and what's in between. So autonomy. Make sure that you make it difficult enough for people to repeat that training scenario so they get better at it, so they develop the skills, so they develop a certain sense of mastery. But also really explain, obviously in the VR experience, the purpose of it. Why is this important to learn? But not only in the VR training experience, also outside of it. So you need implementation, you need rollout when you want to implement, VR training. So it needs some sort of a guidance, tell to your employees why they need to play this VR training and why it has a positive effect on them, but also maybe on the business. So it needs some sort of guidance, it needs a purpose. And eventually, when you really have that story set out, that game goal, you've got, that intrinsic motivation, then it's time to really develop these engagement loops. Think about all these difficult decisions that could happen throughout getting to that game goal. What's interesting dilemmas, Think about reality, where do people really make mistakes and put that into the VR training. Make sure the story unfolds in such a way that it's actually maybe difficult in order to give the right answer. You might get tricked a little bit, which is totally fine. Make sure you film consequences. So think about those consequences, right? So, that's part 2 in those engagement loops, the feedback. Make sure you can film those consequences, So really start thinking about that. But also from those consequences, where can people go? Again, here in the last webinar, we heard somebody talking about loops. So obviously that's an option. You could go back, for instance, to try again within that training scenario. You've got more information. You probably know what to do. But there could also be different actions coming from that consequence. So really writing that script all the way from beginning to multiple endings, that's really creating those engagement loops in order to make it really challenging and interesting. And then, in order to, the right challenge is obviously, a super important aspect. So that's why we've built this walkthrough feature in Warp Studio, so that even before filming, you could, walk through that scenario. And with the right information at the time. So it's a great way also to show to potential players, to your employees. So you already know before filming whether the script, that you've written has the right challenge in it. It's a feature we see a lot being used by our clients in order to figure out, that what they've written is going to work. It's going to be interesting. Gives a engaging VR training.
Yeah, and get to the right challenge, right?
And get to that right challenge, indeed, yeah.
Yeah, so what I see most often in soft skill scenarios is that when you make a maybe not the best or wrong decision, you can continue with that situation. Maybe the person in front of you get more emotional, more angry, more sad, but then you have more options to fix that situation, right? Yeah. You can change your strategy and then...
and that's all feedback. I mean, somebody getting a little bit more angry, that's also feedback. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be big and bold, let's say.
Yeah.
But it could also be smaller.
Yeah, and when you look at safety, you see more, it's like, you have more like game over because it's more impactful decisions, could right?
Be, yeah.
So the fire, the building is on fire, or maybe the patient didn't make it, or maybe your manager getting really angry because you broke something, an important tool or machine, or more, and then you have to come back with that knowledge. All right, if I do this, or maybe I miss a part, or maybe this decision lead to that conclusion. So let me go back and now with this new knowledge try something else and see the consequence of that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. So you always this is something we help our clients with as well, is that you need to give the right amount of information in order to make these decisions. So not too much. Also in the beginning, it's the same with storytelling. There's a prologue, and that only contains the information you need in order to progress throughout the story or throughout the VR training. And this is always the case. So with every VR training that's being made on Warp Studio, it's really also about that. Make sure to give the right amount of information to the player in order to make that next decision, but never too much. I mean, that's not necessary at that stage. And you can, engage people way more in completing that training scenario and getting that challenge right.
Yeah. And one tip that helped me at the beginning while I started creating VR scenarios is I always started with, I call the 5-star path in Warp Studio. So of course, I think when you have one 5-star path in your scenario, that's the most successful path, that's the most stars you can get in a scenario. It is also makes very clear to the learner what you want them to learn, how you want them to deal with that particular situation. But if you start with that, then you have a start and ending point, and from that, it's very easy to create the other different paths. Okay, what will happen if you choose this, or what is an outcome of this answer? And in that way, you build the different branches or different consequences.
Exactly.
Great. And I think this is it for today. We have some questions coming in. One of the questions is, we talked about levels at the beginning, also about Angry Birds and levels. How do you use levels while creating VR trainings?
Indeed, that's very important. Also, in order to get to mastery, in order to proceed. What we've done in Warp Studio is that we've built courses, and courses is actually a combination of multiple scenarios, and they can be placed in an order, meaning that you could create scenarios, for instance, about safety, but create like 4 or 5 scenarios, place them in an order based on difficulty, and make sure that people can play those courses. So courses is a functionality, is a feature. People can be assigned to courses immediately, meaning that they start playing from that initial scenario in the course all the way up to the last one. And those can be seen as levels when it comes to VR training.
Yeah, and do you think courses can only be used for difficulty? Because I can imagine maybe for soft skills, it could also be just different situations or playing the same learn goal, but with different characters in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, eventually, there's so much creativity that you could put into this. So, whenever you say this, I definitely directly get inspired, because you could create scenarios from a different perspective, for instance. But indeed, you could follow up on the storyline. I mean, scenario 1 could be about that sales deal. Scenario 2 could be about making sure that the work is going to be done with that same exact new client. So you could create a bigger story out of this. Absolutely, that's definitely a way to do it.
Cool stuff.
Absolutely,
it inspires me as well.
Yeah.
And the last question is, if we want to learn more about gamification and maybe specific to VR training, where can we find this?
Well, we've created already a bunch of information on our website. We write blog posts about gamification, so we've got a few posts also about autonomy, mastery, purpose, also about this double goal. There's a blog post. So go to our website, warpvr.com/blog. You'll be able to find a lot of information there when it comes to applying gaming for VR training.
Great, thanks, Thijs. And that's it for this webinar. Thank you so much for being here, Thijs. I will see you around.
Absolutely.
And thank you for watching this webinar. If you have any remaining questions, please don't hesitate. Send us an email, and we will be happy to help you with your questions. And we hope truly that you have learned something today, and we also hope to see you in the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks.